Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's Emergent session on the past, present, and future of open science. These lovely folks are going to be discussing open and inclusive collaboration in neuroscience and neuroimaging and how we can make it happen. Thank you all for taking the time to be here. And with that, I will let you get to it.
All right, thank you so much, Katie. Hello, friends, and welcome to Open and Inclusive Collaborations. My name is Angie Laird, and I am a professor at Florida International University in Miami. Fair warning, my husband is currently upstairs Zooming his summer course on mechanics, and I'm going to try to get through this without any connectivity problems or interruptions from either fighting kids or barking dogs. Both of those are serious risks. Big thanks to Stefan and Cass, who asked me to moderate a panel-based discussion about inclusive collaborations in open science, and a huge thanks to everybody at OSR who, in my opinion, have absolutely saved OHBM this year. I think the work that they're doing is just incredible. So with regard to this panel, my viewpoint is that inclusivity and collaborations go hand in hand, and that we shouldn't talk about one without addressing the other. My personal anecdotal experience is that interactions among individuals who are from diverse backgrounds and perspectives, that enhances the innovation and creativity in our research practices and our outcomes. So it's my strong belief that inclusivity isn't something that we should only address with a segment of our community or limit to satellite events or discussions. We all want to pursue innovative research, so our strategies and our practices for inclusivity should be collectively addressed by all of us. And there's a recent PNAS paper that provides evidence in support of my anecdotal experiences that shows that underrepresented researchers do produce higher rates of scientific novelty. However, they also found that these contributions are consistently devalued and discounted. And I will post that link on Mattermost in a little bit. And this is congruent with recent work that most of us are familiar with from Danny Bassett's lab about gender-based citation bias. So in this panel, I want us to start by asking ourselves, when we close our eyes and imagine an ideal collaborator, who comes to mind? What do they look like? Where are they located? And let us consider how our answers may wildly vary based on our backgrounds, our experiences, our geographic locations, and our access to scientific resources. So we've assembled an exciting group of individuals who are here to provide their perspectives on this topic. To start things off, I'd like each of them to briefly introduce themselves. Mispronouncing each other's names is another form of inclusivity and aggression. So I haven't had a chance to meet them yet personally. I want them to introduce themselves in their own words. And then I'm going to circle through, ask each of them 1 or 2 questions to give them an opportunity to talk about the issues they feel that are most relevant for our community. And my ordering of these questions is designed to walk us through our collaborations, our challenges, our access to resources, and our research participants. And then we can finish with an open Q&A from the audience. So let's start with Rotem.
Hey everyone, so I'm Rotem Botvinik-Nezer. I'm a postdoc at Dartmouth College at Tor Weigel's lab, previously a PhD student in Tel Aviv, and happy to be here.
Malvika.
Hi everyone, I'm Malvika Sharan. I am located in London and I'm a community manager of the project called The Turing Way, which is an open source data science book. And I'm also a co-founder of Open Life Science Mentoring Program.
Thanks. Reubs?
I'm a PhD student at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. I study adolescent development and mental health. And I don't know what else to say. That's me. Hi.
Great. David.
Hi, I'm David Selassie Opoku. I'm based in Accra, Ghana, and currently I am a farmer based in Ghana, but I have other experiences that I'll share later that will hopefully be relevant to this.
Thank you. Last but not least.
Hello, my name is Chuan-Peng Hu, or in Chinese style, Hu Chuan-Peng. Now I'm located in Mainz, Germany. I'm a postdoc at Leibniz Institute for Resilience Research. I think that's it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, so let's circle back to Rotem. How can we facilitate collaborations in neuroimaging? What are the benefits of such collaborations? We'd like to hear about your experiences with NARPs and your recommendations for pursuing diverse collaborations.
Hey, yeah, so I'm here in the panel because I was part of the leadership of NARPs project, where almost 200 researchers collaborated to test our analytical variability of fMRI effects results. And I think NARPs is an example of a successful collaboration because we had so many different people participate. We had about 17 different countries from almost all over the world, but not all over the world, this I'll talk about later. But we had from Asia and Europe and US and Canada and South America and Australia. And I think that my experience here was amazing because I was able to communicate with so many different people from all over the world. And I learned a lot from this, from different perspectives. And I think it helped NARPs become what it was and have an impact on the community. But still, I think looking back, we could have reached maybe more diverse researchers group. And I'm happy to hear others here to listen how we could done it better. We use mainly social media actually to recruit, and also the annual meeting of the Society for Neuroeconomics. But we could have maybe even reached more people. So I'm really interested to hear the perspectives here in this panel.
And I think you had something you might also want to say about incentivizing people to participate.
Yeah. Another point is that I think one of the reasons we got so many people, which exceeded my expectation for sure, was that we offered co-authorship for everyone. So I think the incentive was higher because of this, because it wasn't just to volunteer your time or something, you could actually get something for it. And I think it made a significant difference.
Excellent. So building off of that, Malvika, why do you advocate for a collaborative culture in your work? And I'd like to hear your perspective on the unique challenges that face individuals from underrepresented groups, how we mitigate those challenges, and specifically whether or not you think, and obviously I think you do, that mentoring plays a role.
So I'm going to start, and I'm happy for any other speaker to also jump in. The work that I do is really about bringing in people from various backgrounds, from different fields, and share their knowledge in the Turing way as a skill in data science. And it is completely collaborative. And the reason that I advocate collaboration is, of course, we believe that there is a higher power of creation and innovation when diverse perspectives come together, because we all have unique experiences and challenges that we can challenge each other to do better. This cannot happen if everybody shared the same opinion. I think the homogeneous group is not a place for great innovation. Mentoring has huge role in it. So I, with two colleagues of mine, run this mentoring program. And the reason that we run mentoring, especially in open science, because all of us learned open science as concepts on our own, on internet, from friends, from people, only because we needed to learn it. But we realized that we did not know how to apply them in a structured way. And this is something that we wanted to help others to understand, that open science has a lot of power, and it can be harvested only if we know how to step-by-step apply. Think about who we are designing our project for. Think about what they need to collaborate with us, how we can reduce the barrier for collaboration for them, what kind of resources we can avail for people to work with us. And these can be done very well with mentoring. However, our mentoring is to empower people into leading their own project. So it's not really about that there is this knowledge that I think is awesome and you should have it, but it is really about that this knowledge that we share, we can apply in our own situated areas for whatever we feel is important for my society and my community. I think this question really fits well with David. If I wonder if he has something to say.
I do. Malvika, thank you for that. My work, as was mentioned, well, I said I'm a farmer, but before I was trained in biology and computer science. And for the longest time, I was very fascinated with complex algorithms. But there was one time when my dad, who's a farmer, asked me, how are these tools really relevant to me as a farmer? I think that got me thinking, about how we make technology research much more accessible to people who are solving problems in different contexts. So over the past 5 years, I've been working through different organizations like Open Knowledge Foundation to really think about how do we make data literacy skills and resources much more accessible to different people. And I think one thing that I saw from working with journalists, researchers, government officials, sometimes entrepreneurs, is that there was a huge gap in terms of how these skills were being defined and how some of these tools were being designed primarily by people in the high income context. And in definition, that usually tends to be US, Europe, Asia increasingly, but we're missing out people from Africa, Latin America, but even in high income contexts, specific races were also being missed out. So my work has now been, how can we make sure that we are removing these barriers by making sure we are including these people in these conversations, not when it's already been defined, but when it's starting out. So are we making sure they are represented on committees? Are we making sure that when tools are being designed, they're actually part of it to include their context? And there's a lot that we can share around that, but that's where my focus is, and I'll stop here. We can explore that later on.
So let me follow up a little bit with that in the sense of, in talking to you before this session, I know that I had been intending to ask you about open science resources for those who lack resources, and then you flipped it a little bit and it's basically like, conversely, why should resource-constrained researchers invest their limited resources into open and collaborative science? And I think that's a really important point, because doesn't that sort of push us deeper into the cycle that marginalized researchers get further marginalized by some of the activities they participate in, or that they are asked to participate in?
Yeah, so this point or question for me came out from starting open data work and trying to promote it to people in government, researchers in low-income contexts. And there was a lot of pushback because, one, they believed it was a foreign concept. But from having conversations with them, it ended up being, why should I allocate my time and efforts switching what I already know how to do into doing this new thing that you are telling me that is beneficial to me? And what made me realize is that these practices, which we, at least who are bought into it, are convinced that is good for science, it leads to actually better results, have not been argued for in a way that includes these people who are either very resource constrained, they don't have the budget. So for them to go open data, it means they have to retrain their staff, they have to invest in funding that they actually do not have. So they would rather say, okay, if I have to choose where I'm going to allocate my funding, either to pay my staff or to get enough people employed in order for the institution to run, or should I retrain everyone and have new tools in? Which one is it? So that conversation was, can we take a step back and say, what is the context in which people exist? Does collaboration mean different things given different contexts? Sometimes collaboration may seem like coming online and having a virtual conversation, or I'm working on a Google Doc, but for some people, it's actually a huge investment because internet in the first place, at least in Ghana, is a challenge where people will make sure that they don't come online until they really need to. So this is where a lot of those conversations have led me to taking a step back and saying that, who are you as a person? Where do you exist? Where are you trying to go? What are the realities in which you exist? And can we then work back and see how we still achieve all the benefits of collaboration, openness, without also at the same time forcing something down on you and then saying, oh, you're not joining it because you don't want to join it.
Thanks very much for that. Let's switch gears a little bit and move to Reubs, because I'm very excited to hear how do the structures of academia in general and neuroscience in particular penalize and impede individuals whose identities, lives, and work counter dominant narratives, and how might this be addressed?
Sure. Well, I mean, I feel like it follows on quite naturally, really. I think that we have a history, right? Academia has all of this, everything, all institutions have history. And academia as an institution has a history of white supremacy, of violent sexism, of transphobia and transmisogyny, and so on and so on. And when we turn our focus to neuroscience in particular, examples that come to mind for me are to do with we had the example recently of IQ. Yeah, that. There's also I mean, there's also one of the things that's really critical, I think, to think about as neuroscientists in this conversation is we have so much epistemic credibility. If you say, I did a brain scan and it showed, people believe you, even if you don't know, even if you're wrong or it's relatively unfounded. And I think that is it's like you're in a car, right? And like it could be a lethal weapon in the wrong hands. And I think another recent example of that came with the article in eNeuro by Glisk that argues that basically that all of the things that the stress of being trans in a cisgenderist society causes are the cause of being trans in the first place, and that therefore we could be cured with chemicals, which is obviously nonsense. But I think it's interesting that was publishable when, for example, a paper that I wrote about how social processes contribute to the altered proprioception in trans people is published in an ethics journal because neuroscience journals didn't want it. So I think that tells a lot. I mean, in fairness, I was quite glad to be able to go on about the ethics side of things in the end, but you know what I mean? Like, and I think that, if you think about a typical lab environment, right, lab meeting, well, say for example, where I work, it's basically, it's me and 6 other white women, but all of whom are cis. And if I say, I don't really think that that's what you mean by gender, or do you really think that breaking the analysis into 2 groups by gender is actually valid in this context and in this case? I'm in an island on my own, and the homogeneity of the academy produces these situations where even when I think we would all describe ourselves as feminist in our lab, as a trans person, I find myself making arguments that seem entirely foreign to these other feminists. And I think that's, I think that it goes all the way back to recruitment. Like, who do you entrust with epistemic credibility? Who looks like a scientist? I think I look like a scientist, right? Like the color of my skin helps me to look like a scientist. The glasses that I wear help me to look like a scientist, in the way that I dress, apart from the gender of how I dress, right? So I think there's, and I think that's part of how it was possible for me to get hired as a PhD. I think it's possible that if I had more intersectionality in my identity, that wouldn't have happened. And as it is, the process of completing a PhD or any kind of academic work is structured in a way, and I mean, especially more recently, as kind of commercialist, capitalist influences have taken more of have had more of an impact on the practice of science in academia. Those processes they're all about quantifiables, right? And there's no room for I was busy being depressed about the state of the world, which is genuinely something I spend quite a lot of my time on. I think everybody has reasons to be depressed about the state of the world, but some of us, it affects us more directly than others. And
to that point, I want to make sure we emphasize the conversation that we had pre-panel, which was your question about whether or not we devalue contributions from scholars with the lived experiences of these phenomenon. And I think that is something that is really, really important. And I bring up the recent paper that was published about the US funding disparity for Black and African American researchers that they found was driven at least in part by their interest in health disparities, community-based research, and patient-focused interventions. And so therefore, you know, there was this correlation between the topic that was felt to be important by these marginalized researchers and their funding outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think that a lot of it comes down to this cult of objectivity, the idea that the white, cisgender Western man, straight man, is objective as opposed to the most biased, which would tend to be my assumption, that, you know, identities that don't force you to be reflexive because you kind of have to survive. You know, I'm not saying this to have a go at white cis guys, right? But what I am saying is, you know, we have this story that we tell ourselves about the idea that science is objective, and science isn't objective. Science is a political thing, and it's a social process. And like any other social process, you know, it's an argument among people, and we all have our own goals. And yeah, I mean, the ways in which different types of research are prioritized or deprioritized, I think, is really very telling. Another example that I'd love to mention, and then I'll shut up for a bit, was that in the UK, there was a report done on COVID-19 and disparities in who was dying of it. And it was carried out by Professor, I wrote his name down and then I forgot it, which is bad. But anyway, point is, he did this big project, and there was like a whole section that was qualitative work looking at like where the disparities were coming from. And the UK government chose to essentially censor that part of the report. And some of that has to do with, I think, attitudes towards qualitative versus quantitative research, which stems from kind of masculinist ideology in our understandings of epistemology. But I also think that, quite simply, Black people saying, we are dying because of what you're doing, wasn't something that Boris really wanted to publish. Eyebrow.
All right, so you did make a point about recruitment. So and the samples, how we go about looking at diversity among our study participants. So I'm going to swing now to Chuan-Peng, who can tell us a little bit about the Psychological Science Accelerator and how we address diversity and inclusivity among our study participants.
Okay, thank you for bringing this question. I'm also participating in the Psychological Science Accelerator, which is basically a network of collaborative network for different labs across the whole globally. So now there are, I think there are 760 researchers and 548 laboratories, and across 72 countries. So now it looks like we really have geographically diverse researchers and possibly sample size or samples. But still, as a member of this network, I feel that actually geographic diversity not equals to diversity or real diversity, because my personal experience, for example, when I collecting data for PSA projects in China, I just, as everyone do in the university, you just post a flyer around the university, and then volunteers will send you an email, will call you, and then you recruit some participants, and then you send them the link for questionnaire, will ask them to the laboratory, right? That's the typical psychological science going. And then if you do this in China, then you will most likely recruit some people with like at least college degree. But I checked the census data. So if you look at the whole population in China, we have so many people there. And if you look at the education level, only less than 5% actually get college education. So which means all the participants were recruited from China. It was regarded as like geographically diverse in Western's eye, but if you zoom in China, still it's a really, really limited sample. It's not really diverse, at least to me. So I think, yes, we're trying to address the question of diversity in terms of participants, but still it's not enough because typical psychological science using the conventional sampling, which cannot reach to more representative samples. I think in 2013, there's a paper by Fox. They published a paper called Populational Neuroscience in PNAS. They try to integrate some method from demographic research and population science. So use the method developed by those disciplines to help neuroscientists to sample participants in a better way to address the question. But after like 6 years, we still didn't see any change. So we still just do the things in the old way. But I'm not very pessimistic, but we do, because we do have some researchers who are trying to change. For example, I think in social psychology, there's a scholar called Neil A. Lewis. I'm not sure you're familiar with him. So he has basically a movable laboratory in a car. You can just drive a car around and go to the community and collect data there. It's really cool. It's the thing I want to do in the future. And I think diversity also means the research question we're interested in, we're asking. This question, I think the other speakers already discussed this a bit. So I just want to emphasize a recent maybe a piece right by Leo. So he writes that these academic departments, some quite famous for imposing egalitarian and progress values, are willing to hire a scholar with black face, but they made it crystal clear that they don't want their mind come with it. So I think as Asia, I also feel the same way. In the PSA, recently we started a program called the PSA COVID-19 project. We try to also address the pandemic. So there are many projects submitted to PSA, and I reviewed some of them, and I found that what the proposal are from a Westerners perspective is more about how to frame the statement about policy in a gain or in a loss frame, and there was some about emotion regulation. But the most strong feeling from the pandemic is that at the beginning, the huge difference attitude and feelings from East Asia and the Europeans. At the very beginning, East Asians are very anxious, are very stressed, and we wear masks whenever we can. But in the US, we are somehow discriminated because we wear masks. And people don't really show empathy to us because they think maybe it's the Asia disease at the very beginning. So no single project tried to address this huge difference. I was a bit disappointed at that time. Yeah, I think there's maybe some questions I actually arise instead of answer, but I think it's good to discuss this a bit.
And that's totally fine. And the question I addressed to you about the PSA was about recruitment, but I think if we all aren't aware of the PSA more broadly, it is definitely worth a follow-up. Full disclosure, I'm also part of the PSA. We are going to be contributing to their project on stereotype threat. I think that their organizational structure for how different labs are recruited to join the PSA, for the facile nature of the information flow via Slack, and the process for proposing new studies. And I mean, it's really a grassroots endeavor that I am loving being a part of. So I think that the focus on making psychological science less weird is truly, truly important, but what they are demonstrating in terms of their ability to engage with the community at a grassroots level and really make things open and accessible for these large-scale collaborations, I think it's really important. It's a very different approach. I'm also a site PI for ABCD, and so that's also this large consortium-based approach, but it's one that's based on the NIH driving an investment in, looking at brain development over adolescence. So the two projects really show different approaches for these large-scale collaborations that are attempting to, move that ball forward a bit on population science. Okay, so I want to circle back a little bit and is there any follow-up questions that the panel has for each other? Okay, well then I'm gonna push back a little bit, not push back, but just kind of dig a little bit deeper with Malvika about mentoring, because I think that what you were saying about the types of mentoring that you have experience with, it really has value, but I think it's important to highlight the fact that there's a lot of different mentoring that are available to early career researchers. And then I think it's really important to talk about how sometimes the mentoring can be suboptimal. I have sort of feelings that sometimes senior leaders in the field can suffer from a bit of survivor bias, and that this can kind of trickle into the mentoring that they provide. So I think there's really excellent value in walking through young trainees, writing manuscripts, revising manuscripts, submitting grant applications and strategies for being successful in science. But I get really kind of sticky when I see more lifestyle type mentoring. And I think that can be really problematic from time to time. There's still a lot of shaming that goes on about how much we work and how often we work and where we work, and too much commentary, I think, about personal decisions. And from my own perspective, I've definitely experienced that about the motherhood penalty and whether or not it was okay for me to have children at all. So does anybody have any comments on that, and how maybe we can advise ECRs to kind of choose the right type of mentoring to receive?
I can start. This is something that I thought I would actually ask the panelists, but I would start, and I would really love to hear from them. Just to define what collaboration means, and then I'll go into mentorship. So generally, when we say collaboration, I think it's really clear to us that, okay, we're going to collaborate on a project. We're going to be a team of people. We have a goal that we want to work towards. But what we don't really communicate, what else does it involve? How are we supposed to behave with each other? What are the common vision do we have? Who are the people? Do we know about them? Do we even care about them, right? Like, a lot of time the project is so much more important than people, that people forget that there are people experiencing their personal struggles. And to that, in that context, people who provide mentorship have to understand that the people that they are dealing with are not just human who have career ambitions. And I'm saying this from my personal experience. When I first came across mentorship, I was super excited about, biotechnology, and I wanted to learn about how industry work. And therefore, my university found a mentor in a really leading biotech company. And the first interaction I had with them is they coming up with short project for me to do for them as a part of mentorship. And that's not exactly what I wanted. I wanted to learn about what skills do I need. I wanted to hear about what do I lack, what gaps can I fill, how to make a journey to becoming a person working in a company from a person studying in a college. And that mentor did not really understand that there are things like that one can discuss. And I think this is very important when we are talking about mentorship. It's very important that we put people in the center, have a very central design thinking, that we we understand that people have struggle and talk about it. I think this is something that we don't often do in academia, to talk about human struggle. Something that Reubs was saying is, I wanted to actually nod in so much of assurance that whenever there is conversation, and if someone with less power challenges that whatever you said, it does not align with my life, people will reject it because you're a minority and your answer is 1 out of 10. However, in those situations, we need to understand what are the benefit and loss. What am I losing? Am I losing my position by agreeing with someone else's opinion? Is my agreement actually empowering them? If yes, why can I not do it? I think it is really a lot about being a sound box for your mentee, to understand what your mentee needs. One thing that I was reading yesterday says that mentees are the main driver, the mentors are co-pilot. Mentors are not the people who are driving them where they want to go. They are merely being with them, telling them how to get there. So I have a lot of opinions about mentorship just because of my own experiences, and also for the empathy of people that I work with who really want to create a collaborative culture which sustains in a long term. And I think in research, nobody can master any knowledge. We have to collaborate, we need to share, we need to rely on each other, and we can only do that by making each other feel valued and to make them feel like they belong in this collaboration. It's not that they are just a tool that can be disposed after this collaboration is over.
Malvika, I completely agree with what you said. I just want to raise one more thing to this. So you were speaking about the fact that we are all people and the mentor needs to take into account the perspectives of the mentee. But I think we also need to remember that the mentor is also a human being with their experiences and stuff. So I think sometimes maybe, I mean, people have good intentions mostly, and I think that we should give them the benefit of the doubt and maybe try to raise to their awareness better if we need to, if we feel like we're not treated the way we should, because probably it's not because they don't want to help, but because they don't know how, for example. And I think that current events in the US and in the world help to raise this thing. But I can speak from both being like a mentor or a mentee or leading a collaboration or joining collaboration. I think it's hard for everyone to get the to deal with all the gaps, the cultural, all the different gaps we have. So I think it will be good to see this point as well.
Sorry, I'm having a bit of a dog barking frenzy over here. So yes, I definitely agree with all of that. And I'm curious to know, sort of moving into how we think our scientific societies, for example, OHBM, might play a role in this. I think that there is a lot of opportunity for us to come together as an international community to, I mean, there's so many different programs, whether it's the Student and Postdoc SIG or the Open Science Room, where there is this new generation of scientists that are embracing these policies and are more collaborative and are helping mentor each other. One thing that I have had experience with is that, for years I've sort of expressed my views about how societies can be more welcoming to individuals across race, ethnicity, gender, sexual identity. And I have been, receiving some pushback, a little bit of scolding from primarily Western European scientists, for pushing my US-centric agenda, and that it was inappropriate to discuss race or skin color or sexuality, that was not something that was allowed in their society. So I guess my question sort of is, how do we address and integrate our global differences in terms of our societal norms, while at the same time pushing a more inclusive, I guess you would say, agenda? Anybody?
I will probably randomly call someone's name after I say this sentence. I think we always say that we need to identify who's at the decision-making level, right? Like when we talk about diversity, it's not about, hey, you are my student, you are of different race and ethnicity, and that ticks the box for me. It's not enough. These students don't have power. It's really about who is making decision. Our policy being made to give people power of making decision? Often people say, I'm going to make a seat at this table for you, but that's not enough. You need to give power to be able to participate in equal power. Let's say I'm just using power too much here, but it is true. Like you need to tell people,
You're not using it too much. It all does come down to power. Power
it does.
is everything.
It totally does. Like, in data feminism, if folks who are listening to us haven't read it, please bookmark and read about it. In data feminism, you will learn about how everything you do in research, starting from designing your research, collecting data, selecting algorithm, really is affected by who we are as people. What is our personal belief? And I see Reubs shaking her head, and I'm going to call her into the conversation, because it is really give power to people, and people who are in the position of power should be diverse.
Yeah, I mean, so for example, there was an event that I went to about open science, and somebody asked the person who had the head of the society that had arranged the event. He hadn't arranged the event himself, obviously, and yes, he was a straight white cis man, and somebody said to him, "How do we go about getting scholarly societies and grant bodies in particular to pay attention to the extra work that people do in the pursuit of open science? And in particular on the grant bodies that you sit on, do you?" And no, he didn't. He said, "No, I can't, because the other ones don't, like the other bodies." And I just don't think that if any of us were in that room, our reaction to seeing open science on someone's application of like their past work would be to go, well, that's irrelevant because the other people who are making decisions elsewhere don't pay attention to it. So I think, at the risk of being accused of identity politics, I do think that your standpoint, your positionality matters to the kinds of decisions that you'll make. And I think this whole conversation about power ties back in with a lot of the really useful things that Malvika was saying about mentorship as well, because mentors typically have a lot of power over their mentees, and they also have people who have power over them. And the structures, and so you then have a situation where mentors in academic contexts almost always have a conflict of interest between the interests of their mentee and the interests of their own career. And you can guess who usually wins, right? So, and I think that, when we're talking about this idea of power, and who has it and how is it wielded, I think, of course we have to deal with survivorship bias. Of course we have to deal with the fact that women participate in our own oppression, as do all marginalized groups. But I recently have had a really lovely experience where it came out of that horrible Glisk article that I mentioned earlier, and a group of mostly trans neuroscientists, all communicating principally through Twitter DMs, and we've written a rebuttal and what have you. We've also become friends, and there's a very flat hierarchy. Some of us are postdocs. There's one very senior professor in this group. I'm just a PhD student, but we have a very flat hierarchy. And what I say as somebody who has much less experience in the field than a lot of the others gets taken on an equal basis. And I think it's because we are meeting each other as people first, and as people with expertise second. And in Dutch, they have this lovely expression, which I can never quite pronounce right, but it's something like, No, I've lost it, but it's Ervaringsdeskundige. That's it, Ervaringsdeskundige. But it means an expert by experience. And they don't mean experience that you've been working in the discipline for a long time. They mean experience in the sense that you've lived the thing. So, for example, a patient with Alzheimer's disease or a family member of someone with Alzheimer's disease is a Ervaringsdeskundige about Alzheimer's, whilst most Alzheimer's researchers typically aren't. And certainly when we talk about studies that center differences between marginalized and less marginalized groups, I think, you know, we see that same pattern coming up where, and I have to say, I don't think that the Netherlands is better at this just because they have a word for it. But I do think it's really important that we understand the ways in which, if we understood the ways in which research is me-search, there would be more room, I think, in the way that we have the conversations to sort of decay those power imbalances. Because part of the reason those power imbalances are so entrenched is because they're replicated on multiple levels, right? I'm trying to draw a diagram. I don't have a whiteboard. You know what I mean, though. The power imbalance between me and my very excellent supervisor is not just that she's my boss and she gets to say whether my dissertation is ready to be submitted, although that's an important one. It's also that I'm trans and she's cis, and and when I'm writing about trans stuff, she still gets to say something about what I'm allowed to say and what I'm not allowed to say. I mean, not really, but in practice, she has that power, and she's not used it inappropriately. But that's not the point, is it? And I think, you know, that perhaps this experience I had with my group of trans colleagues has been what it's like to be a cis straight white man in neuroscience, where you're surrounded by people who get you in that, you know, who get your demographic positionality just by default. But then again,
the dominant one.
Sorry?
When it's the dominant one.
Exactly. Yeah. I think is where minorities are the dominant.
Right. I'm going to jump in a little bit and take the Dutch comment, and folks have made me realize that I told y'all I was going to do a terrible job with following along with the audience questions because I'm focused on, you know, the dialogue itself. Let me start with some of these audience questions. The first one: how can we overcome the language barrier in science, especially in open science? David, Chuan-Peng?
Yeah, I can throw in some thoughts. I think it relates to some of the things that I've said already. If we have the predominant institutions, organizations that are seen as leading in the field, communicating in a specific language, there is that tendency to have that language be what becomes the language of communication. And this is why I think in terms of inclusion, particularly in low-income contexts, we need to work to understand why a lot more institutions with other language contexts are not publishing. Is it because there are specific ways of assessment that is not making their publications visible or easy to reach other people? Before this call, I did a little bit collection of publications from Google Scholar using a Python library. And most of the publications, the affiliations were institutions that were in the West and predominantly, of course, in English, right? So what is that? If that is the predominant thing and all the papers that are being cited are from there, then that's the first challenge. So I do think it goes back to the point of going back and understanding if other papers are not being published in other languages. Why is that not happening? Is it because it's just too difficult to read a paper that's not in English? Why is it difficult? Are there languages can capture different things that English and other predominant languages cannot capture? So why not make the efforts to also be able to read a paper in that? So my answer to that would be, again, we need to go back and understand why aren't there enough publications in neuroscience in other languages? Is it because we've established a system that everybody has to conform to in order to get grants, and it has to be in English, or all the editors are speaking in English or in French or a lot of the Western languages? And if not, is it because people are not able to use the programming languages and the programming tools in their own languages, so they're not comfortable and will not even spend the time writing a paper and communicate that? So it goes back to redefining what a researcher looks like and what a researcher could look like if we don't have the current system that is in place, and can we overhaul it?
There we go. Thank you for that. I'm gonna move on to the next question so that we have time to get a couple, because I know time is running out. Our OSR helper has let us know that will be available on the Mattermost channel afterwards if there are additional questions. But I want to get to, are we even recruiting these samples accurately? The questions are often based on limited race labels that don't necessarily provide insight into ethnic identity. I definitely have capital F feelings on this myself. I think that, you know, from a study reporting standpoint, particularly if that study reporting is reported back to a funding body, like in the US to NIH, there are certain demographic bins that we have to put people in, and a lot of times race and ethnicity is conflated. Although there are separate race ethnicity bins for NIH formatting that basically ask people if they are Hispanic Latino or non-Hispanic Latino, and then ask about race questions. And coming from Miami, where we have a very complicated, diverse population, we understand that, you know, this sort of binary binned representation of who we are in terms of our race and ethnicity is just not cutting it. And that's even just in the US. You know, if you throw open more broadly the global population, yeah, we don't have a good system for that. I advocate strongly for adding a measure of ethnic racial identity into your study samples that you know, much like gender, doesn't force you to bin into this choice or this choice and make it a binary thing, but really captures identity across a continuum. And there are a lot of good measures out there that can do that. Does anybody else have a response to this question that they want to run with?
I think it also depends on the purpose of the study. Sometimes maybe we don't really think it's important, but I think the paper I mentioned, like for 2013 in PNAS, they are from the perspective population science and then like demographic and more social science perspective. They already have developed method for sampling and for this kind of, for example, social stratification. So they have different ways to address the question we have now in neuroscience. I think maybe we need to partner to collaborate with them instead of like invent the wheel ourselves again.
I've had a conversation not long ago about gender, but the same sort of problem applies. That where the sort of the argument that came up was, do we want to covary out the effect? Do we want to disaggregate it into males and females? Do we want to invent a whole new branch of statistics that has room for bimodal distributions? And I think probably we want something like the latter, ideally. I wonder if anyone has any thoughts on how that might apply to race and ethnicity, because I think there's, with gender, although it is multidimensional, I think it's much easier to collapse it onto a single dimension than with race and ethnicity, which is already 2 dimensions there, and each of them is multidimensional as well. Does anyone have any thoughts on that, or am I just spitting in the wind?
I mean, in Miami, it is complicated. We have a predominantly Latino population. And so when we talk about ethnicity and race, for many times we do so from the context of acculturation and biculturalism, because that is something that all of us here in Miami face in terms of, you know, there are sort of two competing cultures, and that we also have an enormous population of immigrant and migrant individuals who live here, who are in the midst of assimilating the culture here in the U.S., as it is Miami, and sort of that internal balance that they're fighting to retain a sense of identity with their existing culture while embracing their new culture. So it's complicated. Given the time, I'm going to throw in our last question, which is a different topic, but have folks been thinking about racial disparity in face stimuli to study recognition behavior, especially in the light of the great work that's being done on the racial bias in face recognition technologies?
Comes back to objectivity, doesn't it?
For me, it comes back to who's writing the code.
So power and objectivity.
Yes. Who's writing the algorithms and how much bias are they embedding into the algorithms?
And
I
what
think
data
this just
they're
reminds,
using.
sorry.
I just said, and the data also matters, right? But Malvika, go.
No, this is exactly what I wanted to say, that what I've learned is that nothing is untouched or raw. Nothing can be called raw. So algorithms are not biased, but how we are designing it is biased. How are we collecting data is biased. And therefore, this conversation is completely about AI and will probably require a decade for us to decode.
Yeah, for sure.
And additionally, I think this notion that these tools that have a significant impact on society need to be created by experts, including us who are computer scientists, and we need to hoard it off so we feel good about the fact that we are smart, intelligent people who can build awesome tools. This is what we need to disrupt and make it much more possible for other people to probe them. So I'm not talking about only people who can go into artificial intelligence, but can you make it possible that people are literate enough with algorithms and data to be able to, if they need to, understand how it's working? And I think it goes the same way. Once we democratize things in that sense, then people can interrogate these tools and then they can bring in their context in the sense that this is not working for me as a woman or a man or person of different color or different sexuality. I think the ability to think about who is creating this, what are all the limitations, and how can we put it in the hands of more people? And again, going back to my point, now that's why I'm working with farmers, because all the awesome things that I think I can create, can I make it accessible to them? Can they actually understand what open data is and why it makes sense for a farmer who's thinking about how much yield can I make and make enough money to feed my family? How does this apply to me? Once we can do that with the tools that we build, I think the better the chances of reducing the potential biases and misapplications, hopefully across the world.
I think part of this is also about how we treat the boundaries between disciplines. So I think there's something about for example, a neuroscientist who spends time reading STS work about neuroscience is rare, right? And I think if AI developers had a more disciplinarily diverse as well as demographically diverse workforce, you would see a different pattern emerging. So you need critical theorists and STS people and feminists and what have you to say, you're missing this point or you're missing that point. And I think, just an example that I can't resist sharing is the new body scanners in airports always doesn't, whatever gender the security person thinks I am, the machine will then think that some part of my anatomy is a weapon. And it's not, it's just my body. But that's because they trained it on only cis data. Like if anyone in that whole company was trans, you kind of got to think they might have thought, oh, hang on, those people exist too. And of course, there's a whole discourse around, security rhetoric and theatre and so forth. But I think at the bottom line, even if you thought it should exist, these body scanners in airports, they could have been designed in a better way. And yeah, it's just another example of the same thing.